Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. This is the first in our new series through the Save Pennsylvania's Forest Coalition. And my name is Sarah Corcoran. I am the coordinator for the coalition. I am the Forest Watch coordinator for the Sierra Club Pennsylvania chapter. And today I am happy to introduce Ben Sands. He is a forester at the Tiadaghton State Forest, and he will be informing us about all sorts of interesting things related to that particular state forest district. We will have time for question and answer at the end of the webinar. If you have any questions that you would like to put into the chat before then, I will be reading them off at the end of the webinar, so that way we don't have everyone having to come off mute and ask their questions independently. So as we're going along, just put your questions in the chat and we'll make sure that they get answered at the end of the program. With that being said, Ben, I turn it over to you.
Okay, thank you. Good morning, everyone. I'd like to thank you for joining me and thank the Sierra Club and Save PA Forest Coalition as well for inviting me to speak on behalf of the Tiadaghton State Forest. For those that don't know me, as Sarah indicated, I'm the forester in charge of recreation for the Tiadaghton State Forest, and I've been working here for approximately 10 years in that position. However, my work primarily was forest ecology based prior to working for DCNR. And that work included ecology and dendrochronology work on the Menominee Indian Reservation, data collection and research at the Mohonk Preserve in New York, Valley Forge National Historic Park and Fort Indian Town Gap. And I also worked for the U.S. Bureau of Land Management and briefly with the U.S. Forest Service Research Lab in Morgantown, West Virginia. I was hired in part in this position because I met the qualifications to be a traditional forester who would manage timber, for instance, but primarily because I'm really passionate about recreation, especially non-motorized recreation, and more specifically hiking, cross-country skiing, and hiking and camping. So I have a pretty extensive background with those forms of recreation, and I've had the opportunity and privilege to hike thousands of miles in the country. So today I just wanted to give everyone some background on the Tiadaghton State Forest, a little history, and then I'll talk about who works here and what our jobs are. And then I'll delve into more detailed information about recreation in the Tiadaghton State Forest. So I don't have a lot of time to go into detail about many components of this presentation, but as Sarah said, feel free to ask later or contact me afterwards. So interestingly, the meaning of the word Tiadaghton remains a mystery. It is the word that the Native Americans referred to Pine Creek as, and perhaps means river of pines or bewildered river. Pine Creek itself is really the defining feature of the Tiadaghton State Forest and what most people think of. It is a very large stream, often considered the largest creek in the country. It's quite wide, and it forms kind of a basis for recreation in the valley, and is really quite scenic. The Tiadaghton State Forest is one of 20 in the state. So these are districts managed by the Pennsylvania Department of Conservation and Natural Resources. It's labeled District 12, and it's located in north central PA, primarily located within Lycoming County. However, parts of it are in Potter, Clinton, and Union counties as well. The district boundaries shown on the map they don't actually reflect the public land, but rather some other responsibilities that DCNR is required to attend to by law through our public service, namely forest fire protection and service forestry. Service forestry being the outreach that we offer through service forester to private landowners to help them better manage their land. The idea of creating better forests for the common good. So the public land in the state is better depicted on a map such as this, where the shaded green actually represents State Forest land. So there are approximately 2 million acres of state forest land in Pennsylvania, of which, well, that represents about 13% of the total forested area in PA, which is really not a large figure, but is still significant. The Tiadaghton State Forest accounts for about 147,000 acres of that total. This is further broken down into some special areas we have in the district that are defined as natural areas or wild areas. And then we have areas that are available for commercial forestry, where we do timber harvesting, and there are other areas that are off limits based on slope or soils, etc. The forest types in the district, they can be broken down into two primary categories. If you can identify Lycoming County on the map, you'll see that the Appalachian oak forests are kind of a predominant forest type in the district. This is primarily chestnut oak, white oak, red oak, black birch, red maple, hickories, white pine. But as you move farther northwest in the district, closer to Potter County, what we see are more northern hardwoods. So you get more black cherry, beech, red maple, sugar maple. So these forest types are largely driven by what's under the forest, the geology and landforms in PA. Interestingly, Lycoming County is kind of a convergent spot, this place where these different physiographic provinces meet, and what we have is the Pine Creek Valley, and the bulk of the district in western Lycoming County actually lies in the Deep Valley section. So we have these plateaus that were cut by a body of water. In this case, it was Pine Creek and a couple other streams. However, farther to the south, we have the Appalachian Mountains section, which really lies in the Ridge and Valley. So this is, here is a picture of the Deep Valley section. This is looking north on Pine Creek from Vista and Bull Run. And you can see really the steepness of basically the valley walls, and how it basically flattens off on top into a plateau. In contrast, in the southern part of the district, more along the Susquehanna River, we see these broad valleys, as you more normally see in the Ridge and Valley and throughout the Appalachians. So you have these broad valleys kind of outlined with these kind of defined ridges. And what you'll see is in both of these photos were numerous houses and farmland. And what's important to note is we have a lot of inholdings, but people have been here for a long time. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail about Native Americans in the area. I'm certainly no expert on the topic, but what is known is that the Seneca and the Susquehannocks frequently used both the Pine Creek Valley and the Susquehanna Valley for numerous purposes, whether it was trade, warfare, transportation, etc. So these corridors were very important to them, and this has been well documented because early settlers interacted with the Native Americans in these areas. Throughout the Pine Creek Valley, we have all these small villages that really sprung up in the late 18th century. And really the common thread here is ties to timber, lumber, and sawmills. Williamsport around the same time was considered the lumber capital of the world. And really a lot of the lumber that was produced in Williamsport built a lot of the cities in the east. It's kind of hard to imagine that now, but this area had a significant impact with the construction and development of the east. All of these photos were taken from the Pine Creek Valley. Interestingly, trees were cut down and transported early on by raft and or floated down the river carefully. to Williamsport, and later a lot of mills, sawmills began to pop up throughout the valley. This really changed pretty drastically with the development of the rail system in the Pine Creek Valley. The Pine Creek and Buffalo Railroad was the primary rail system, which would later become and what is now used as the Pine Creek Rail Trail. However, there are many other railroad grades, and were utilized by different locomotives. These smaller engines, these Deshay engines, which were going up and down the valley walls, transporting timber and flagstone. Many of these would become and are utilized as hiking trails today. As a result of all this logging in the Great Clear-Cut era, we had a tremendous amount of environmental degradation and really a need for something to be done about it. This was really a black eye on in Pennsylvania's land use history. Not only did we cut 80 to 90% of the state's timber, but then it was often followed by these devastating and often deadly forest fires. These two gentlemen are often given credit for their work to protect the land and develop a system in which we could do so. Rothrock and Pinchot really were the founders of forestry, both in Pennsylvania and the US. And really Pennsylvania was kind of at the forefront of forestry at that time. And we see the development of a forestry commission in Pennsylvania before 1900. So it dates back quite a ways. By the early 1900s, the Forestry Commission in Pennsylvania was already planting millions of trees and growing millions of trees in their nurseries. This was further aided by Roosevelt's Tree Army, the CCC. And the district actually has numerous CCC campsites located within its boundaries. But their presence and their legacy should not be overlooked, for they planted hundreds and hundreds of trees, not all of them native, but their reforestation efforts should be noted, as well as the infrastructure they provided. Today we have a forestry system that looks more like this organizational chart. Things have come a long ways, for good and bad, maybe. That's debatable, but anyhow, we currently have one district manager, often called the district forester, who oversees two assistants. These two assistants have a breakdown in responsibilities. We have some clerical staff. We have two permanent forest rangers. They're in charge of law enforcement. And we have three maintenance divisions who are in charge of infrastructure throughout the district. And a lot of that is road maintenance. And then I'll talk a little bit more about the recreation component of the maintenance later. In addition, we have 8 foresters, and their duties are listed on the right side. 4 are primarily timber management. One that deals with the fire program in the district, that's fire suppression, as well as prescribed burns. He also has some timber management duties. We have 1 forester who works with private landowners. He's our service forester. We have 1 gas forester who does all that he can to minimize the impact of gas development on state forest land. And then there's my position. In addition, we have 2 technicians who also assist us in our duties. Our other duties are listed below and are quite extensive. Some of these would certainly be their own positions in a federal organization. In terms of recreation in the Tiadaghton State Forest, we've historically aimed for recreation opportunities that provide a dispersed low density model. And the idea was that this would be the most sustainable and have the least impact on the public land. And these opportunities historically were hiking, cross-country skiing, horseback riding, camping, hunting and fishing, etc. But it's expanded considerably over time, and now incorporates types of motorized recreation that are a little more damaging to the environment. But the Tiadaghton district has a long history of recreation, and perhaps one of the longest reaching histories of recreation in the state. Historically, you could argue that a lot of the recreation began on state forest land with the idea that the state came up with to lease these really small parcels of land to private landowners. And this began in the early 20th century and wasn't halted until 1970. Over time, people would have these leases, and then eventually they've been able to pass them down through their heirs. We currently administer 156 of these leases in our district alone, and there's something like 4,000 statewide. But the primary purpose for most of these camps was and still remains for hunting and fishing throughout the forest district. And I believe the origin of this is around 1910, but James Klein from Williamsport established a Boy Scout camp near Ramsey Village in the Pine Creek Valley. And here we really start to see recreation take off with youth in the Pine Creek Valley. And this camp really, it really progressed and built a lot of momentum following World War I. And we start to see types of recreation that we more commonly associate with more modern recreation. We see a lot of camping, see a lot of canoeing, swimming, and hiking in parts of the Tiadaghton State Forest. And not to mention the top center slide is actually a picture of a suspension bridge crossing Pine Creek that spanned 409 feet and was considered the largest east of the Mississippi at the time. And would eventually collapse a couple years after Hurricane Agnes, which kind of led to the demise of the camp. We also have this very interesting tie to the military and a special part of the Army. So a former district manager of ours, Francis Kennedy, he became the district manager in 1949 after World War II. But he was a veteran of the 10th Mountain Division, and they were trained in all things mountain related, mountaineering, rappelling, skiing, and many of these veterans went on to create the most famous ski resorts throughout the United States. And Francis came back as a wounded veteran from Italy, actually, but he didn't develop a major ski resort. But he really wanted to promote cross-country skiing. Francis had hired a man by the name of Bob Weber. Many of you may have heard of him. And Bob was hired as a maintenance foreman, a supervisor, and he and Bob began doing a lot to create cross-country skiing opportunities in the state forest and created some of the oldest cross-country ski trails we have on public land in Pennsylvania. We really have a large network of ski trails. I'll touch on that briefly a little bit later. But this is an interesting part of our history. Francis also would later hire a man named John Eastlake, a man who had gone to school for forestry, who also had interest in recreation. Bob and John became pretty good friends over time. And in the 60s, they would go up to the Adirondack Mountains, and they came up with this idea that we could have something similar in Pennsylvania, an opportunity for people to get outdoors to hike and recreate. And they wanted to bring that back to North Central PA. And so they did. John and Bob went about scouting and laying out where they thought some trails could be constructed, some hiking and backpacking trails, and then they got permission to actually build them using volunteers and youth organizations and their own professional skills and their labor. These are considered some of the finest trails in the state. The Golden Eagle Trail, a little over 9 miles, is considered the best day hike in Pennsylvania. And the Black Forest Trail at around 42 miles is one of the most popular backpacking loops in the state. Shortly after they built it, it immediately drew backpackers and outdoor enthusiasts. These are some older photos. Actually, I received these from John Eastlake in the past. But anyhow, you can get an idea that it didn't take long for these trails to become popular. And today, we advertise that we have over 600 miles of trails open to hiking. And I would argue that this is kind of the mecca of high quality hiking in the state. Our trails are not extremely rocky, they're more friendly for hikers, and they are still extremely challenging and offer perhaps more vistas per mile than just about anywhere else in the state. So John and Bob did a tremendous job laying out the Black Forest, Golden Eagle, and Bob Weber trails. John also worked with Walton Nicholson and Tom Thwaites to establish the Mid-State Trail through the district. The Boy Scouts had actually developed a series of trails out of Camp Klein, one of which was the Tiadaghton Trail. And then we have numerous other trails that are really sought after by hikers and backpackers. As I mentioned earlier, we have numerous designated cross-country ski trails, and these are in addition to the Pine Creek Rail Trail, which we also set a cross-country ski track on in the winter. So we offer tens and tens of miles of cross-country skiing for the outdoor enthusiasts in the winter months, as long as we get snow. And then we also offer over 500 miles of cycling opportunities. Mountain biking is really popular, especially those who really enjoy the more technical riding. A lot of people ride up our forestry roads. These are dirt roads, and then they will descend these pretty technical trails downhill. But the bulk of people come to the district to ride the over 40 miles of the Pine Creek Rail Trail, which was on the Buffalo and Pine Creek rail bed. It is a well-maintained trail at this point for cycling. We also have many camping sites that are available to the public. The bulk of these are actually primitive sites, and they are not mapped. They are accessible through most of along our hiking trails, and don't require a permit as long as you're not staying in a sensitive area or in the Pine Creek Valley. We do have several campgrounds in the Pine Creek Valley itself, and these do require permits, and some of them have amenities. We have restroom facilities at a lot of them, and fire rings, picnic tables, and running water at some of them. And our camping permits are free for those that don't know. In addition, Pine Creek itself is considered a water trail, and it is a huge draw in the summer months. So along Pine Creek itself, we have 8 non-motorized boat launches that we maintain, and then many people flock to the stream throughout the year for different types of fishing. It's parts of Pine Creek are well known, especially the northern part, for fly fishing. Although I would say the better fishing is actually the warm water species, whether it's smallmouth bass, catfish. I would argue that that's a little more exciting than some of the trout fishing we have. And then we also offer over 300 miles to horseback riding. We have a trail system in the southern part of our district that is for shared use purposes, open to equestrian, mountain biking, hiking. It's all non-motorized recreation. We also have shared use trails throughout the remainder of the district, and a lot of our forestry roads are also open to equestrian use. We also allow some motorized recreation in the district. We've historically, there was a time when ATVs were not really regulated in terms of where they could ride, but that had changed a few decades ago, and they basically put the ATVs in these closed systems, these ATV trail systems in numerous state forests. Ours has 18 miles, and it's open to a couple different types of ATVs. We have these smaller ATVs, as you see pictured below, but we also have trails that accommodate larger ATVs that are these more recent side-by-sides that you'll see on trails. And then we have about 75 miles of snowmobile trail, and then 101 miles of forestry roads that we also allow snowmobiling on. So there are a lot of opportunities for snowmobilers to ride in the winter months if we have snow, and we do groom for those as well. And pictured the top is one of our snowmobile trail groomers, and they've been trying to keep things as nice as possible for this user group. So how do we manage for all this recreation? What does my job entail, and what are some of the problems we face on our public land? Well, part of this is that we have one of our maintenance divisions is almost solely recreation based, and their primary duties are to maintain the Pine Creek Rail Trail, and that includes everything from regrading the trail to blowing off leaves to cleaning culverts to removing trees and large debris, to cleaning restrooms to painting facilities, working on the solar powered fans on them, mowing the grass, just general maintenance, and it is a tremendous amount of work. And then a lot of my work, it varies considerably, but I do spend a decent amount of time in the office. I try to kind of prioritize that in the winter months, especially if I can put anything off until then. But I do everything from updating spatial data that's used for mapping, all kinds of annual work plans. I create maps. I do environmental permitting for different projects. I work with architects and engineers at times, and I do paperwork for land acquisitions for our district. I draw up the signs, and I also coordinate the volunteer program. A big part of my job is actually working with these large groups who want to recreate on state forest land, and also outfitters, because we have quite a few people who have outfitting businesses on Pine Creek, and then we have these organized events that consist of quite large groups, and these events can be just a local fun walk or run on the Pine Creek Rail Trail, consisting of under 50 people, to these really large races, and some of which are national and even international events. We do host the Eastern States 100, and the bulk of that course is actually in the Tiadaghton State Forest, about 67 miles of hiking trails in our district. And then I also spend a lot of time dealing with the management of the Pine Creek Rail Trail and the facilities. So while I'm not always the one out doing the work, I'm kind of the person behind the scenes trying to resolve issues, whether it's problems with aggregate on the rail trail, putting in restroom facilities, putting in campgrounds, and dealing with the funding, the design, and trying to troubleshoot problems. But what I'm really most passionate about is trying to kind of keep our recreation, or try to go back to the roots of what Bob Weber, John Eastlake, and Francis Kennedy really had started, which was to maintain our hiking and cross-country ski trails. I want to promote that more than anything else, because I think that has the least damaging effect on our forest. So I do spend a considerable amount of time assessing trails, clearing trees of blowdowns, and cutting back brush. And I'll try to cover I try to cover a minimum of 300 miles a year with a chainsaw, but I can't do it all by myself. After I assess some of the trails, I can get help. Sometimes there are these tasks that seem almost monumental. We have trails that get washed out during flooding events, or that top center photo shows you these massive rocks that came down off the mountainside onto the Tiadaghton Trail. And I was able to enlist some of our staff members to help me in those scenarios. But then I get special groups that help. These pictures are from the Pennsylvania Outdoor Corps, and it's a collaboration between DCNR and the Student Conservation Association. And what we do is I'll come up with a project, and it has to be approved, of course. And I might have to do some environmental review paperwork to do it, but I often try to improve recreation opportunities, especially and almost solely on non-motorized trails. So I'm trying to either connect these old logging grades that would form perhaps a bigger loop, or improve a trail system that has been neglected for years or degraded, such as all the trails that the Boy Scouts built at Camp Klein. I used this organization to rehab almost all of them and rebuild them, and now they're extremely popular. Or we connected some logging grades and Gamble Run to create a 5-mile connector trail that joins the Mid-State Trail and has also become extremely popular. And these are just a couple of examples. Also, I spend a lot of time working with volunteers, and I have the privilege of working with some really, really talented and nice people. These include Keystone Trails Association, the Mid-State Trail Association, local volunteers, local high school outing clubs, running groups, and Boy Scouts. And we've been able to accomplish a lot in the district on an annual basis with this volunteer work. And then I do want to touch on a couple of things that are perhaps they're serious concerns of mine, and everyone else that I work with. I've listed here part of the Pennsylvania Constitution and the Bureau's mission to start off this segment. And it's important that anyone that is mindful and really cares about our public land and wants to protect it, that they know this well, this slide. What we've seen in the past 10 years is something that's been detrimental to our public land, and it has caused a lot of conflict, both with recreation, but it's really contradictory to why we as an organization exist. And it's really kind of a sad chapter in Pennsylvania's history. We've lost over 900 acres due to gas development, unconventional wells, also known as fracking well pads, impoundments, pipelines, additional roads, etc. And this is really an unfortunate part of our state forest now. Over a 3-year period, you can see on the left is 2010, on the right is 2013. We went from having a fairly contiguous, densely forested district to a highly fragmented one, unfortunately, which has become common throughout much of the US, especially in the Western United States. And this has a lot of far-reaching implications for recreation. I have overlaid some of our major trails, and this is the Waterville area. The Mid-State Trail is seen in orange, the darker orange. The Tiadaghton Trail is represented, the Pine Creek Rail Trail in red, ATV Trail in green. And there is a lot of conflict with the gas development and recreation. Both our hiking trails, our non-motorized trails, the Pine Creek Rail Trail, and motorized recreation too. The orange trail with the diamonds in it on kind of the center of the screen, that was all snowmobile trail, and none of that actually exists anymore because of gas development. But there are other issues relating to it. The seismic testing was really the noise pollution was incredible. Increased mortality of wildlife, damaging the aesthetics and the experience of people who really came to the valley to enjoy state forest land. Things such as cofferdams on Pine Creek that if you would have asked me that if that was feasible, I would have said never. But they did it, and it was really unfortunate. But and the impact, it impacted people that live in the area as well. It had far-reaching impacts, including the degradation of the land, but also pollution at times too, with large spills and tributaries of Pine Creek. And then I guess I would, the other major thing I would like to bring up is this idea and this new policy that the ATV trail development in the state and state forest land was restricted due to a moratorium. But as of last year, that was lifted. And the idea is that the state is going to provide more opportunities for motorized recreation in the state. And this is really unfortunate because this is really not compatible with protecting our resources or the land itself. These pictures were taken from the Hatfield-McCoy ATV trail system in West Virginia. And I chose these because I think they're very disturbing. The last thing I ever want to see in a waterfall is an ATV or an ATV running in a stream. But I also want to inform you that it is this is a very true threat, and it is nearly impossible for us to enforce the numbers that could potentially be here in terms of the ATV community and its presence here, if it turns into something like the Hatfield-McCoy ATV trail. And so anyhow, I want you to be aware that this is going to happen in our state forest system. Pilot program is underway currently, and routes are being mapped, and we are trying to minimize this impact. But I have sincere concerns about this type of recreation in our district and what it's going to do to our resource. I guess I'm going to start wrapping up by giving you some links that you can find out more information. The Bureau of Forestry's website is listed, along with a site where you can find out information for each specific forest district in the state, and then a link to contact your state representatives as well. I would highly encourage you to come visit the Tiadaghton State Forest Resource Management Center. That is our district office. We have a lot of interpretive displays. We have historical artifacts in here. We offer free maps and information to the public, information about trail conditions. You can and you can have a conversation with many of our employees regarding what we do and the state forest land resources itself. And then finally, I would encourage anyone to get involved by becoming a DCNR conservation volunteer. It's pretty simple. I oversee the volunteer program. I would ask that you contact me. I like to know what's going on, and I won't blindly approve of someone who just fills out an application and thinks that they're good to go. I try to steer people towards the work that I would like to see done. And if we can improve our existing trails, that is usually my goal, and to keep the state forest as clean. So litter pickup is a big part of it too. But then if you complete an application after talking to me, I'll approve it, and we can do good for the public land here. So that's all I have at the moment. So I think we can open it up to questions, if that's all right with Sarah.
Yes, I think that sounds wonderful. We did have a few questions in the chat for you, Ben. There were a few related to fracking within the district. One was answered through your presentation, but another one was asking about if fracking companies were required to remediate damages caused once their wells are no longer in use.
Are you talking about reclamation more specifically?
He had stated remediation, but I believe reclamation would work as well.
Yeah, my understanding is that is part of the contract with the company that has developed the land. In fact, we have sites where we have gone in, and we actually have a mock pad site that we went in and kind of rehabbed, just to really to analyze and study soils, vegetation, reseeding it, etc. However, I don't know all the ins and outs of that information. I would gladly get back to you. It's really not my area of expertise here in the district.
All right. We did have another question based on around volunteer resources. Thomas was asking if there were like a bank of resources, or if there's a way to provide resources for volunteer trail maintainers, like education resources, access to tools, equipment, that type of thing.
I see. Yeah. So oftentimes I will try to work directly with the volunteers, but we do offer tools within reason for volunteer work. I'm trying to think. We do, when you sign up, you're also, I think you're covered. Basically your health insurance is covered as a volunteer if you're working for the state, which is definitely a perk too. And if you do something that requires a gas powered tool, we will provide gasoline for you as well. Hopefully that provides some of the information that was being sought.
We had a question from Anne asking about mountain biking. Okay. And if increased popularity of mountain biking has any negative environmental impacts on the forest.
Well, I would say yes. It has had a negative impact in some cases. I would say those impacts are primarily related to the degradation of trails that they are not actually supposed to be riding. So mostly our state forest hiking trails, the Mid-State Trail, and our local district hiking only trails, such as the Tiadaghton Trail. We constantly have people riding those trails illegally. And what happens is they typically ride down the trail, and they can't make the tight switchbacks that were developed for foot traffic only. They round off the trail. It allows water to not run off the switchback properly, creates a path for the water to continue down the trail, and it further erodes the trail. That's just one example. But yes, mountain biking has caused some issues in the district. So I recently updated the information on the Tiadaghton's webpage about mountain biking because I felt that it was really lacking and it was definitely outdated. So hopefully that'll help improve people's knowledge about what they can and can't do.
We had a question asking what the difference between a wild area and a natural area are in the state forests.
Boy, that's kind of a tricky one. Wild areas, they're typically, I believe they're, I'd almost have to look it up because I don't know the exact definitions, but what the wild area is really trying to protect the wild character of the land. And natural areas are often trying to protect resources that are, or plants, geological formations, things that are within those areas. And both receive special kind of management. The natural areas are more restrictive. It is really more of a hands-off approach. In terms of even, I don't think I'm even supposed to like clear a trail in a natural area. I might be able to get special permission, but they definitely receive a little more regulation than the wild areas even.
We had a note in the chat that since John Eastlake was mentioned, they wanted to give a note that he was lost due to COVID in the past week. So
Yeah.
there are some thanks in the chat for his contributions.
Yeah, and yeah, unfortunately, I believe it was pneumonia related, or just kind of. But it was certainly related to his battle with COVID, and it's a great loss because John did a tremendous amount of work for the Forest District, and we are certainly mourning his loss here. But he will be remembered fondly.
Let's see. There were 2 other questions that we've had so far. I want to, keep an eye on the time here.
Mm-hmm.
We had a question about ATV trails and if there are any ways currently to stop the infiltration of ATV trails on state forest land.
I would hope so. We're currently dealing with what they're calling it a pilot project, and the idea is to connect these closed loop systems to one another. This would also allow ATV riders to basically bounce around to different establishments in the PA wilds, go to vistas, and we are trying to minimize that impact. As far as what people can do, I would hope that they would complain. I complain internally, that's for sure. And there's not a forester or staff member here that likes the idea. We definitely see it as a small subset of the population who has lobbied to allow this to happen. I would contact your state representatives if you cannot, or you don't feel that you're making any progress with the district staff.
And let's see, we had a question about if there is a possibility to get a waiver for group hikes in state forest lands due to COVID.
Okay, so we do have guidelines in place right now. We basically adhere to the Department of Health guidelines established for the state. And what we do is, it's important for people to know this, and I should have stressed it earlier, but any group of more than 10 people at a minimum needs a letter of authorization. It's free, it's simple, but you need to get permission from the district to do it. And that has come about because of impacts to our state forest land, and also through numerous search and rescues where we end up having to deal with people who get lost or are unprepared for the activity that they are pursuing.
We had a question on who makes the decision or gives permission for pipelines and power lines to be run through your state forest?
Well, I think that is more or less hashed out largely outside of anyone in our forest district. I don't know how that actually plays out, to be honest. I do know that our staff, our gas forester, and the district manager will work together to do everything they can to try to minimize that impact once we're told we have to do it. Is kind of how that works. I think there's I would imagine that the company is often dealing with basically people at the higher levels of DCNR, whether it's the assistant state forester or state forester.
We have about 5 minutes left, so I'm going to hit you with a couple of easier questions right now, Ben.
That's fine.
The State Forest Resource Center that was posted in your presentation, we had a question on where that is located.
It's in Waterville. So you have to go up, well, from US 220, you drive north on PA 44, and the little town of Waterville is about 1 mile south of the district office. So you stay on 44, 1 mile beyond the town of Waterville, and we have a long drive up to our office driveway. And then we're kind of perched on a little a knoll that you have a spectacular view of the Pine Creek Valley.
The next question is, what's your favorite overnight hike in the forest?
My favorite overnight, just one night, I suppose. Boy, that's really tough. I have a lot of them. I really like, so actually the picture that's up on the screen right now of Hemlock Mountain, I don't know, maybe people aren't familiar with it, but if you get a Black Forest Trail map, you can see that the Black Forest Trail actually traverses it. And on Hemlock Mountain, there's a spectacular view looking south on Pine Creek. And you can make a loop if you go out the cutoff trail, and you can stay on the Black Forest Trail, and you can loop back to basically your starting point by connecting trails that way. And that's really, it's a challenging hike, but it takes you both along the ridge shown in the photograph, but down into some of the valleys and remote streams in the district, and you can circle back. It's pretty scenic.
And then a question asking about the new trail that was just added in the forest district, and if you could give a few quick thoughts about it.
Yeah, so I'm assuming they're referring to the trail I named the Eiger. So I lived at the base of Bull Run Vista 1 near the district office for several years, and in the winter I would put on crampons or micro spikes when the weather got really crummy, and which was what I was looking for, and I would scale the side hill up to the vista. Actually, I'll go to it real fast. I showed it at the beginning of the presentation, and I used to do this frequently, and I always thought if I ever had the time and resources, I would finish a trail that would connect to this vista. Prior to me working there, the Jersey Shore Outdoor Club had worked on an old logging grade that got you partway up to this vista on one side, and then I worked with a DCNR intern to connect their work to one side of this vista, and that was about 8 years ago, maybe. And then there was, on the other side, there was already a grade that went to some of these, to these large quarries, but then I used the Pennsylvania Outdoor Crew, or Corps rather, and I laid out a series of switchbacks, which are pretty challenging and rewarding, but they get you from those quarries up to the vista on the other side. So now it forms a nice maybe 2.5-mile loop once you get to the bottom of the trail. It's accessed off of the Tiadaghton Trail, and I named it the Eiger because Bob Weber had named 2 other prominent features in the Pine Creek Valley after major mountains. So there's Half Dome, just south of Slate Run, which is a very difficult hike. And then looking north from where he resided most of his life, you could look up Pine Creek and see this prominent peak called Gillespie Point on the Mid-State Trail. He called that Pennsylvania's Matterhorn. So I was trying to kind of follow suit. And when I looked at the Eiger in Switzerland and the famous climbing route, there were actually a lot of similarities in terms of the aspect and everything. And I made a map and named some of the features along the route after the Eiger route too. That's probably more information than I wanted to know.
One last question, and then we will say our goodbyes.
Yep.
With all of these trails in the state forest, are any of them accessible or ADA compliant?
Yeah, so that's a tough one. The Pine Creek Rail Trail is really the most accessible for people with disabilities. Unfortunately, most of our trail, it would really depend on the disability, to be honest. In terms of wheelchair use, the rail trail is really the best choice. Our ski trails are usually more gentle and could possibly be used. But unfortunately, a lot of our trails are just really rugged and they're not most suitable for people with disabilities, unfortunately.
All right. That was our last question, Ben, and it is just around 12 o'clock right now. Thank you again so much for agreeing to come and speak with us today.
Oh, you're welcome.
If anyone thinks of any other questions that weren't asked during this presentation, please feel free to reach out to myself or Ben. Our contact information will be provided in the follow-up email when we send out the recording of this presentation and a copy of the slideshow. And we'll make sure to send out a few resources like links to the volunteer page as well. So thank you again so much for coming, Ben. We appreciate it. And now we all know a little bit more about Tiadaghton.
You're welcome, and thank you too.
Yep. Enjoy your day.
Yeah, you too.